Good day and welcome to another exciting live stream event proudly brought to you by Arrive Live and Burn Shield. We asked you guys to submit all your burn-related questions, which we will answer throughout the show, and at the end of the Q&A, we will award a Burn Shield burn kit to the 3 best questions. So let me introduce you to the man who will be grilling Burn Shield, Mr. Johan Jong from Arrive Alive, South Africa, and in the hot seat, Managing Director of Burn Shield, Mr. Joel Levy. So Johan, without further ado, fire away.
Yeah, perhaps on my side, I think the timing is perfect. Yesterday we had quite a few road crashes in South Africa, and in 2 of those road crashes the vehicles were inflamed, burnt out, and we do have often burn injuries in road crashes. On the Arrive Live website we have several pages of content specifically dealing with safety from vehicle fire, and we love a collaboration with Burn Shield so that we can share more information on burns and how to treat burns. Joel, thanks a lot for joining me for this. Can you perhaps, as a start, just give us a brief background on Burn Shield, the company, how everything started, and your areas of focus?
So Burn Shield started 30 years ago. The primary reason was that we found there was a need for a good, simple, effective treatment for burns. Many beliefs about what you should and what you shouldn't do for burns were around in the market, and I think everybody puts something on a burn to make it better, not to make it worse. Often they result in the outcome of the burn being marginalized and affected. So we decided to do a burn dressing, a water-based burn dressing which will cool and soothe, offer some pain relief and shock reduction, and minimize the infection. So we started this 30 years ago. The product range has developed over the years from a quality point of view. The basis of the gel formulation has remained consistent. Just the range has developed. The quality of the outer packaging has improved, and of course we've always maintained our focus on all the international accreditations that are required. So really our focus has still remained on the emergency care for burns, how to treat it very quickly and effectively, from whether you're a qualified trauma nurse, whether you're a trauma doctor, or whether you're mom at home. The simple message is the same: put the dressings on as quickly as possible, cool and soothe, and offer relief to the patient.
We can say that Burn Shield is a proudly South Africa success story. Perhaps for the audience, to how many countries do you export? How many other countries use our burn wrappings, burn gel?
So Burn Shield, of course, is produced in South Africa. We often get asked the question, are we the Asian for Burn Shield? So Burn Shield is produced in South Africa, in Johannesburg, 30 years. We supply the local market, of course, across all aspects of the local market, and now up to between 42 and 44 countries worldwide that we export to.
There are a lot of misperceptions out about the treatment of burns. What would you regard as the biggest misperceptions? I know a lot of people say, we really advise that, for instance, you must put your arm, if you've burned your arm, under water or flowing water. Are there specific risks? Is it always safe?
Well, cool running water is the principle of cooling, and Burn Shield's formulation, being 96% water, actually supports the fact of cooling. And often it's the case of how much cooling do you effect, what do you do, and is it practical to take the patient to the water source? We bring the water source in the form of Burn Shield gel to the patient. So we don't overcool, we just cool the affected area, and we make sure that the patient receives pain relief, shock reduction, and infection control. And we take away the myths of the oils and fats and greases, and many people will tell you Coca-Cola, condensed milk, mini meal, toothpaste, raw cream, honey, potato skins, chili powder. These are all myths that have been bandied about, and again, not to make the burn worse, but a lot of the reasons why we don't advocate the use of those products is that they seal the heat, they keep the heat in the wound, and they don't allow the heat to evaporate out of the wound. So therefore, the burn continues to progress, the heat stays in the wound, and the damage that is normally inflicted or that is infected is now aggravated because you're using those types of products which are not ideal for any burn wound management.
Perhaps also important for us, when we think of burns, we normally think of fire. But there are many different types of burns. Can you perhaps explain to our listeners or followers the different types of burns that you find, and would Burn Shield be effective for all those types of burns?
So most burns are heat burns. We find the majority of burns caused are heat burns. Direct flame, hot water, steam, scalds. This is what happens. 70% of burns in South Africa are domestic. 50% of burns worldwide are domestic. So a large portion of burns happen at home. So what you tend to find is that for most heat burns, flame, fire, hot water, steam, scalds, you can use any Burn Shield product, no problem. The two exceptions that we tend to specify or highlight the most of are electrical and chemical burns. Electrical burns, the advice and the protocol is to switch off the power source first. If you don't and you touch the patient, he will remind you that you've forgotten to switch it off. So switch off the power source first, remove the patient away from that particular electrical source. Look for the entry and the exit points for that electrical flash. And often you'll find that people make a mistake. They'll only treat the entry and the exit point. For an electrical burn, you have to treat the entry and the exit and everywhere in between. Then you treat as a normal heat burn. Chemical burns, the protocol is to flush the patient, to get rid of the chemical, be it the acid or the alkaline that is in place, get rid of it, flush it out with some running water. Extra time should be spent on the eyes, on the facial area. So normally about 10 minutes for normal areas of burns, an extra 2 or 3 minutes if it's on the facial burn. Once you've done that, you use Burn Shield as normal.
I think also perhaps important for us, during the past week we shared content on the Revive Life website about emergency first aid kit for motorcyclists. And it was interesting for me, I asked an expert from a Motorcycle Safety Academy for information. He also made use of an expert who's actually in Dubai at the moment to compile the content for us. And they gave some examples, and I was actually pleased to see that Burn Shield was also mentioned as one of the products that you have to have in your emergency first aid kit. What exactly are friction burns? And is that what we normally find, why you have Burn Shield for your motorcyclist? And also, I see that in the sports bag that you have for the left right emergency first aid kit, there's also Burn Shield in there. If you are a hockey player, rugby player, even netball player on a hard surface where you play, what exactly would you say are friction burns, and why would Burn Shield also be effective in treating friction injuries?
Well, friction burns is a form of a heat burn. So if you have an accident on the road and the body makes contact with the tar is immovable, it's solid, but you tend to slide across it and get a bad friction burn or a bad graze, happens to be caused by the scraping of the body over that particular surface. When it comes to sports injuries, most, for example, hockey now is on AstroTurf. So you find that you get a lot of these injuries taking place from that as a result of the body sliding across that rubberized surface, causing friction. And you treat it then as you would a normal heat burn. So if you find a friction burn taking place, whether it's in a motor vehicle accident or in a sports injury on the sports field, you treat it as you would a normal heat burn. Just if you think from a motor car accident point of view, if you can, without any further danger to the patient, try and remove any excess grit, dust, small stones, sand that would have embedded itself in the wound if you are able to, but then you apply Burn Shield directly over the patient.
During the recent fires in the Vrystaat, I actually reflected back a few years ago. I had a kind of unfortunate experience to have been at the airport in Bloemfontein, where a young farmer was trapped by a fire in the eastern Vrystaat. And I was there, they did the emergency air evacuation. Sadly, his organs gave up on him a few days later. When we talk about burns, I know with road crashes we always talk about the first hour as the golden hour. How important is that first hour when you see that somebody has been injured, has been burnt, and what do you need to do in that very first hour?
First hour is always critical. In fact, the first 10 to 15 minutes are important. If you apply the wrong treatment to the burn, you can certainly aggravate the wound. You can make sure the burn goes deeper and the burn gets bigger. So if you apply burn shield in the first minute to 30 minutes, you have the opportunity to release the heat from the wound, and therefore you minimize the damage. Unfortunately, even with an injury, depending on the nature of the injury or the extent of the injury, sometimes burn shield will not be able to save that person's life. The injuries will be far too extreme for burn shield to be effective, but at least you will give some relief to that particular patient. But generally speaking, because we see that most burns are superficial or partial thickness, which is the old first and second degree burns, if you treat them correctly, if you use cool running water, or if you have burn shield available to be used immediately on site, the outcomes generally are far greater in favor of the patient than if you just left the patient untreated at all. So the sooner you get burn shield on, the more effective it becomes.
Perfect. Perhaps some secondary burns. What do we regard as secondary burns? And then perhaps a very important question. We can treat, I know parents can treat normal small burns, but what would be the signs that you need medical advice, that you need to go to a doctor or hospital for more treatment?
Well, if you look at some of the burns that take place at home, generally speaking, are superficial to partial thickness burns. It could be severe sunburn, it could be falling off your bicycle, having a friction burn, it can be hot water, steam, scalds, fire, and flame. Those burns tend to be treated or are able to be treated at home by using burn shield. When you find that the burn tends to blister extensively or that the burn looks infected, you can just see by the nature of the wound. And you find that the burn itself is not responding 100% to the initial treatment. I think good common sense, Johan, should always prevail. And if you see that after the first hour that the burn is still progressing at quite a rate, or the patient is in distress, then you should leave burn shield, you should leave it on, and you should take the patient to hospital as soon as possible to seek further medical attention. But the signs of a first-degree burn are the normal reddening of the wound. Some blistering may occur. When it comes to a second-degree burn, definitely blisters will appear. And you'll see also by the nature of the burn, the intensity of the heat that is retained within the burn itself. And normally with burn shield being applied after the first 30 to 40 minutes, the heat would have been dissipated out of the wound. And therefore the progression of the burn would have stopped. Now you're just treating the wound, which happens to be caused by heat, or flame or steam or scalding. So those are the two key issues. Of course, the full thickness burn, which is the old third degree burn, tends to be charred and blackened and less painful, by the way, because all the nerve endings have now been destroyed. And if you find that the patient presents himself or herself with that level of burn without responding much to pain reactions, you tend to know that all the nerve endings have been destroyed, and it's time to really get that patient to hospital as quickly as possible.
Can you perhaps, you have a lot of products here, can you perhaps explain to us, for the home, for instance, or for the car, what is the difference between a dressing and the sprays that you, for instance, have? And when would you use each of these products?
So when it comes to first aid in general, the kits that we produce cover 4 basic factors, cover cuts, burns, bleeding, and CPR. So if you look at the burns aspect of when burn shield is involved, the dressing is the number one product of choice, because what you need to do on any burn any wound which is now occurred as a result of an incident, that protection to the skin has been destroyed. So when you apply the dressing over the wound, you not only cover and protect the wound, you also protect anything from the outside getting into the wound. So it limits the bacterial the growth, the colonization of bacteria on that particular site. It keeps the burn area moist and covered. So the dressing is still the number one product to be used on a burn wound. Where the hydrogel spray comes in, it comes in applications in 3 different places. One is difficult to get to areas. You can imagine behind the ears, on the crease of the nose, under the arms, in the groin area. These are difficult areas where to attach a burn dressing. So if you need to, you can take the spray, the hydrogel spray, spray it onto that affected area. And as long as the gel makes contact with the wound, cooling will start. So the spray is used to be applied on difficult to get to areas. It's also used for severe sunburn, and it's also used to rehydrate the dressing. So if you put the dressing onto the wound, and there's a tremendous amount of heat which is retained in the wound, the dressing may start to dry out sooner than later. Understanding the dressing is a water-based dressing. You can take the spray, rehydrate the dressing, and continue using the same dressing as long as the dressing is not damaged or soiled. So it's for rehydration, for difficult to get to areas, and for severe sunburn.
Perhaps something a little bit different. If I were to suffer an injury, a burn injury, and I call an emergency number, do you work with the healthcare industry specific? How do the paramedics or first responders, do they receive specific training on treating of burns and using your product, burn gels, in hospitals, for instance? Do you work closely directly with specific burn units? How does Burn Shield get the product and the advances in technology, in burn technology, out there? Can the general public be kind of be at peace of mind that the oaks that will treat them knows exactly what to do?
We've looked at that that's a professional point of view. So all the paramedics, trauma nurses, occupational health nurses, we're fortunate in South Africa that these are very well, highly skilled, highly trained professionals. I've been privileged to work with a number of them over the past 30 years, and I have to say that the level of nursing and the level of trauma and emergency advice that is given in this country is really outstanding. So they really learn from the quality of those professional people. Right from the beginning, when we started out with Burn Shield, we did extensively in-service training in hospitals to trauma units and emergency care departments. We gave training to ambulance services and ambulance colleges. As the years have progressed, Burn Shield, I'm happy to say, has become a standard for burn care. So the level of updates that are now required are far less than in the beginning. But we do send out information. We do maintain our connection with the professional sector at all stages. Plus, from a consumer point of view, via our social media, we do make available very basic, simple, good information as to what you should and what you shouldn't do for burns should that injuries take place. What you can and cannot do, who you should call, which emergency number you should call, and where the product is available from.
Do you believe, I should ask, where can people buy the product? Do you think South Africans or the general public are safety aware enough to have a first aid kit in the vehicle at all times? That at every home there is a first aid kit? Or is it something that we need to create a lot more awareness of? I know you recently developed very nice animation on the treatment of burns, which we will also from our side give a lot more attention, a lot more focus. But do you think a lot more awareness is needed among South Africans, or we are heading towards a festive season where we always find a lot of burns around Christmas, a lot of the informal areas where we have major burns and stuff? Is a lot more awareness needed in South Africa?
Well, two parts to your question. Education and awareness is a continuous aspect of what it is that we do. So when we are able to partner with you with Arrive Alive, this sends out a very important message to so many different people. So that aspect of our business is something we work hard at, and we make sure we give a lot of information at any stage where relevant to the general public. When it comes to a first aid kit, it's ironic that most people will buy a first aid kit or a burn kit once the incident has already taken place. They very seldom are prepared for that eventuality, and they will tend to buy something once the accident has already taken place. So the information to educate, to make people more aware is ongoing. It's 100% correct what you're saying. They need to be made more aware of safety. They need to understand that accidents don't only happen to other people. The accidents happen to everybody. And if you could prevent them, we would not need any ambulance services or emergency departments. But accidents are those unforeseen circumstances for which we are not prepared. So the more information, the more availability of product that's made accessible to the public. And we have our kits available in major retail outlets, well-priced, well-stocked, good content, and very easily and readily available to all people who need them.
Perhaps it's something that one of the readers or followers also asked. Hypothermia. What is the relationship between burns and the risk of hypothermia?
Hypothermia is a question which has been bandied about in my 30 years of being a seller, a promoter of BurnShield. It comes across at every given opportunity, and it's very difficult in large area burns to separate hypothermia from the burn itself. But a number of doctors that I've spoken to have always given me some very good, solid advice, and certainly the trauma doctors here in South Africa and some overseas. The first one is treat the burn, not the patient. And the one good thing with BurnShield, because of the size of the dressing that you select, it will only then be effective on that area of the body. So in the old days, they said, cover the patient with as much water as possible. So if you have a bad burn just here on the arm or on the chest, and now you cover this patient with a huge amount of water, you're now really increasing the risk of hypothermia. Whereas with BurnShield, you're only covering the affected area, and therefore you reduce the risk of hypothermia. So important aspect is cool the burn, not the patient. And the second aspect, in any triage situation, they always tell you to treat the worst first. So if some person has a burn injury and cannot breathe, there's no point treating the burn injury the correct way. And the priority is to open the airways, make sure the patient can breathe, and then treat the patient for the burns. And hypothermia is the same. You treat the worst first. You treat the patient for the burns, and you address hypothermia as best as possible. And there are many methods and ways now that you can manage the risk of hypothermia.
Now, there are so many questions that we can still ask. I don't know, Cara, perhaps over to you as well. If there are specific ones you think we also need to ask. I will also, I must say, on the Arrival Live website, we will get these questions, put it in writing, right, put it as content there. So when people search on the internet for specific answers, we will make it available. So we can also add to that as well. But we will put a lot more focus on, I think, all the social media channels, and to provide the best possible advice that we can. I really appreciate your assistance today in answering a lot of these burning questions.
Look, Jan, a lot of these questions are very simple questions. They're not new questions. These are the same questions people ask us time and time again. So I think the importance of partnering with you and through Arrival Live is to answer these questions and to give people some peace of mind that the management of that burn, whether it's in a factory situation or at home, is very simple. And by using BurnShield as an effective means of the first phase for burns, you can minimize the extent of damage normally caused.
Okay, so we've got some questions that came in from online, and the first one is from Adeline, and she just basically wants to know, can I use BurnShield on any type of burn, and how long should I leave BurnShield on, and how long does the burn wound actually take to heal?
Okay, so quite a few questions. So first is, how long do you keep BurnShield on? So BurnShield is prescribed for the first 24 hours. So the first cooling aspect is within the first hour. Thereafter, you keep the burn area moist and covered, and you control the infection. That's the basis of what BurnShield does. Again, if you find after that period of time that the wound looks like it's still infected and getting worse, you should seek medical attention. But you can use BurnShield for the first 24 to 36 hours. What's the second part of your question?
How long does it take for the actual wound to heal?
How long does it take for the wound to heal? Depends on the severity of the burn. It depends. Everyone reacts very differently, and that's why I think if you ask any professional, they would rather treat someone who's had a finger that maybe has been badly damaged than treat a burn, because the burn can change within half an hour to 3 hours. So it's important to understand the progression of a burn, that if you leave it untreated, it can very quickly progress from a first-degree burn into a second-degree burn, and that brings about itself its other complications. So our advice is always to use Burn Shield first. First hour is the cooling aspect. Thereafter, you keep the burn area moist and you control the infection.
Okay, great. A question from Kyle. Can you break down which dressings are best suited to where the burn is situated?
So Burn Shield's range construction has always been very simple. We try to keep the number of products that we have to a minimum to make sure they're very effective. We can produce 500 different dressing sizes. What we decided to do is to make sure we only produce a range that is suitable for each body part. So it depends on the size of the burn. We have the basic burn dressings are 10 by 10, 20 by 20, and 60 by 40 centimeters. A lot of people categorize those as small, medium, and large. To give an example, if you have a 10 by 10 size dressing, it's normally for small area burns, the 20 by 20 for medium sized burns, hands and face, and the 60 by 40 dressing for large area burns, the total head and neck area, back and chest, and small children you can wrap in the dressing. But a good point to remember is that when they classify burns, from the public's point of view, not so much in depth, but in area, how big is the burn? They call it body surface area. And a good rule, if mom is at home and she's not sure, a good indication, if she's phoning a doctor or she's phoning a call center, an emergency call center, if you take the patient's palm represents 1% of the body surface area of that particular patient. Please understand it's the size of the patient's palm, not your palm. So if mom takes the palm of the child or the person who has been injured, she can get a rough estimate of how big that particular burn is when she's calling in for medical advice or medical assistance, and she can give the operator some idea as to how big that burn is, which will then tend to escalate the severity of that particular call.
We have a question here from Brandon. What's the difference between a second and third degree burn?
I think I explained earlier on with Johan that the secondary burn is what we call a deep partial thickness burn. This will redden, this will blister immediately, extremely painful. And it's the one burn that, if not treated correctly, can easily progress into a full thickness burn. The reason why it's so painful is because all the nerve endings are still exposed. It's almost like if you have a filling in your mouth or a hole in your tooth, that when any hot water or cold water goes over that particular area, it's highly painful because all the nerve endings are exposed. Exactly the same with the burn injury. So it's a bit ironic that if you can still feel the pain, the burn is not so deep. When you come to a full thickness burn, it's normally charred and blackened and scarred, and all the nerve endings have been destroyed, plus the underlying tissue and fat layers have been destroyed. The biggest indicator is that there's no pain. So that's always a good indicator of whether you really get that person to the hospital as quickly as possible. Less pain shows that the depth of the burn is far more severe.
So we have another question here. For a third degree burn, which specifically do you use, the hydrogel or the dressing?
It's not so much the classification of the burn, it's more the situation of the burn. Where is the burn located? If you can apply the dressing to the affected area, the dressing is the number one product of choice. The hydrogel comes into effect for difficult to get to areas or to rehydrate the dressing.
Okay. Spiwe asked, my son got burnt by a hot plate, so I used Burn Shield. I removed the Burn Shield and saw bleeding. I don't know what to do.
It depends how long they kept the dressing on that initial wound. Bearing in mind that Burn Shield is a hydrogel, wet, water-based dressing, so it will dry out. In summer, the dressing will last for a shorter period of time than it will in winter due to the temperature outside. So maybe she kept the dressing on for too long. And therefore, when she looked to remove the dressing had adhered to the wound, and therefore, when she took the dressing off, it could have pulled some of the skin away from that particular wound, which then caused the bleeding. But I don't think that the dressing caused the bleeding. She probably left it on for too long and should have replaced the dressing within the first 24-hour period.
Okay, we have another question from Adri. Hello, I have a beauty salon and offer plasma pen, which causes burn wounds. What should I use to treat, heal, and prevent scarring?
So Burn Shield in its current form is not a scar management product. But what it will do, it will minimize the extent of the damage. Naturally, you should have less damage and therefore you should have less scarring. But everybody scars differently. So all we're saying is that burn shield should be used to minimize the damage. And currently there are scar management products available which are well documented, which should then be used to treat the scar. But normally you treat the scar after about 2 to 3 weeks post-burn.
Okay, and last question that we've got 2 more questions that have just come in. Is sweat bad for a burn?
I didn't know the answer to that particular question, so I did a little bit of research. So I'll tell you what I did find is that any burn wound heals better in a moist environment. And by activating the body's natural response, the sweat glands are activated to produce moisture. So it's more the activation of the sweat gland which is important, because that keeps the burn area moist rather than the sweat itself. So if you have any excess fluid on top of the wound, it shouldn't be a problem, but in fact the body's natural reaction for the sweat glands to be active is actually a good thing.
So can burn shield be applied on top of a blister?
Burn shield can be applied on top of the blister, bearing in mind that everything under the blister is sterile. It's the body's natural protection. So as soon as you touch something hot, the body, in some instances, will form a blister as a protection. Everything underneath the blister is sterile. And therefore, from a home domestic point of view, you should leave the blisters intact. Let the paramedics or the trauma nurses in the emergency departments, let them decide when to break the blister and how to treat it thereafter. The initial response to anyone is to leave the blisters intact, put the burn shield dressing or spray over the blister, and take the patient to hospital if needed, or continue treating them from home.
Okay, and last and final question, it's actually quite a good one, we actually get asked this quite a lot, is should burn shield be stored in a fridge?
Burn shield is not required or specified to be stored in the fridge. The optimum temperature at which to apply cool water to a burn is between 15 and 19 degrees. And therefore burn shield's gel formulation, the thickness of the gel, the manner in which we produce it and the manner in which it should be stored doesn't mean it should be kept in the fridge. If you do put it in the fridge, it's probably a bit cold when you apply it onto an open wound. But burn shield should be stored at normal room temperature, opened and applied as indicated.
Perfect, thank you. And for all our listeners and viewers out there, where is burn shield available?
Burn shield is available in most key major retail outlets from a consumer point of view. Most of the pharmacies and retail stores will have it available either in individual dressing, gel or kit form, as you alluded to. And from the professional side, it's available at all state and private hospitals.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Johan, for joining us today and for asking all your questions and putting Joel in the hot seat. Just to let all our viewers know that we will be looking at that draw of the 3 best questions, and we will draw and announce those 3 winners for those Burn Shield burn kits. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, gentlemen.